9 words. That is all it takes to erase a woman's future. Eliza Hartwell stood alone on the depot platform in Silver Creek, Montana territory, 2,500 miles from home with $12 in her pocket and a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. The words on that paper were written in a hand she had never seen before, a hand that had not bothered to form the letters carefully, a hand that had scrawled its verdict the way a man scrawls a note to his butcher or his farrier. Someone whose opinion does not matter enough to merit penmanship. Too plain-spoken, too willful for a proper bride. She read the words once, her hands trembled. She read them a second time. Her jaw locked shut, teeth pressing together hard enough to send a line of pain up through her skull. She read them a third time and the trembling stopped. Something else took its place, something colder, something with edges, anger, clean and bright and useful. The kind of anger that burns away grief the way a brush fire clears dead wood, leaving nothing behind but hard ground and the faint smell of smoke. She folded the letter with deliberate precision, pressing each crease with her thumbnails until the paper held its shape like a small, sharp weapon. Then she looked up. She had never seen a sky this large. It stretched from one edge of the world to the other without interruption, without mercy, without any of the comforting barriers she had known her entire life. No tenement walls, no factory smokestacks, no laundry lines strung between buildings so close together you could reach out your window and touch your neighbor's curtain. Just sky, enormous blue pressing down on the land like a hand pressing on a wound, heavy but not cruel, not kind either, just there. Vast beyond anything her Boston eyes knew how to measure. The depot behind her was a squat wooden building with a tin roof and a sign that read Silver Creek in letters that had once been black and were now the color of old rust. The platform was rough planking, warped by seasons of snow and sun, and her trunk sat at her feet like a faithful dog waiting for instructions. That trunk held everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses, 1 pair of good shoes, her mother's cameo brooch, 3 books she could not bear to leave behind, a sewing kit with needles fine enough for silk and strong enough for canvas, and a photograph of her sister Nell, 14 years old, standing in front of their aunt's boarding house in Boston, with her chin up and her eyes bright and her lungs slowly filling with the thing that was killing her. Nell, the name moved through Eliza like a current. That was why she was here. Not romance, not adventure, not the trembling hope of a new beginning in the Western territories. Arithmetic. The cold, irrefutable arithmetic of a woman who had looked at the numbers and understood that the only asset she had left to trade was herself. Nell's medicine cost $4 a month. Aunt Fletcher's rent cost $6. The garment factory where Eliza had worked since she was 17 paid $11 a week when there was work, which there often was not. She had done the math on a scrap of paper at the kitchen table one night in January, her fingers stiff from 12 hours of stitching collars, and the numbers had stared back at her like a sentence. Not enough, never enough. Not enough to keep Nell alive. Not enough to keep a roof over their heads. Not enough to outrun the slow grinding machinery of poverty that had already taken their parents and was reaching now for their children. The advertisement had appeared in the Boston Herald on a Tuesday in October. Prosperous rancher in Montana territory seeks bride of education and refinement, must be willing to travel. Passage provided. The words had been plain and businesslike, and Eliza had read them with the same plain businesslike clarity that governed everything she did. She did not dream about this man. She did not imagine his face or his voice or the life they might build together. She imagined Nell breathing freely. She imagined medicine arriving on time. She imagined a wire transfer to Aunt Fletcher every month, regular as a heartbeat. She wrote to Jasper Crane that same evening. His letters came back prompt and courteous. 6 months of correspondence, 6 months of careful measured words on good stationery. He described his ranch. He described Silver Creek. He described the mountains and the skill and the quality of the air, which he said could cure most ailments if given time. He never described himself. Eliza noticed this but did not remark on it. She was not shopping for a husband. She was negotiating a contract. And now the contract had been voided. 9 words on a crumpled piece of paper delivered not by the man who wrote them, but by the station master. A stooped, tobacco-stained man named Emmett Guthrie, whose fingers were the color of old leather, and whose eyes held the careful indifference of someone who had watched this scene play out before. Women arriving on westbound trains. Women leaving on eastbound ones. The ordinary commerce of hope and disappointment that passed through his depot like freight. Happened sometimes, Emmett had muttered when he handed her the letter. Return ticket is paid through. Eastbound comes at 8 tomorrow morning. The method of delivery was the detail that cut deepest. Jasper Crane had been inside the depot when her train pulled in. She knew this because Emmett in an unguarded moment had told her so. Crane had watched her through the window. He had watched her step down from the car, look around the unfamiliar platform, tilt her chin upward in the way she always did when she was frightened but unwilling to show it. He had studied her face, her posture, the wrinkles in her traveling dress, the dust on her shoes. He had conducted his inspection from behind glass, the way a man inspects livestock at auction, and he had found her wanting. Then he had scribbled his verdict, passed it to Emmett, and walked out the back door without a word. He had not spoken to her. He had not introduced himself. He had not given her the courtesy of a conversation. He had looked at her through a window and decided that the shape of her chin and the set of her shoulders told him everything he needed to know about her fitness to be his wife. Too plain-spoken, too willful for a proper bride. How did he know I was too plain-spoken? Eliza said to the closed ticket window. We have never exchanged a single word. Emmett's voice came muffled from inside. Reckon he saw enough. He saw a woman in a wrinkled dress stepping off a train. That is what he saw. No answer. The ticket window stayed shut. Eliza stood on the platform and felt the afternoon sun on the back of her neck and the mountain wind on her face and the vast, indifferent emptiness of a land that did not know her name and did not care whether she lived or died or stood on this platform until the wood rotted beneath her feet. She was 24 years old. She had no family within 2,000 miles. She had $12. She had a return ticket she had not asked for, purchased by a man who considered her a failed transaction. She would not cry. She had made this promise to herself somewhere in Nebraska, watching the endless prairie roll past the train window like a bolt of cloth that never runs out. Whatever happens, you will not cry where anyone can see you. She had kept that promise through 5 days of bad food and sleepless nights, and the growing dread that she was making a terrible mistake. She would keep it now. She could still hear her own voice from the morning she left Boston, standing in the narrow hallway of Aunt Fletcher's boarding house, speaking through the crack in Nell's door because Nell could not bear to open it, could not bear to watch her sister walk away. I will send for you, I swear it. Just hold on a little longer. Nell had not answered, but Eliza had heard her breathing on the other side of the door. That thin, labored, whistling breath that sounded like wind through a cracked window. The sound that kept Eliza awake at night. The sound that had driven her across a continent to stand on this platform with 9 words and $12 and nowhere left to go. Forward was closed. Jasper Crane had made that clear. Backward was impossible. Aunt Fletcher could not carry the weight of a 14-year-old girl's survival, and the garment factory would not hold Eliza's position, and the money for Nell's medicine would run out before the train reached Chicago. She pressed her lips together hard enough to taste blood. She folded Crane's letter one more time, smaller, tighter, until it was the size of a playing card, and she slipped it into the pocket of her dress like a blade she might need later. Then she heard the footsteps. Not one set. 3. And the depot platform shuddered beneath their combined weight as if the boards themselves were bracing for impact. Eliza turned. 3 men stood behind her in a loose triangle, dust on their boots, and afternoon sun catching the sweat on their shoulders. And the sheer physical scale of them took the air from her lungs in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with simple, involuntary astonishment. The tallest one stood at the front. He was enormous, not heavy, built, the kind of body that comes from years of swinging an axe hauling timber, breaking ground, wrestling livestock into compliance through nothing but stubbornness and superior leverage. He wore a leather vest, dark brown and cracked with age, open over a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled past his elbows, and his forearms were roped with muscle and mapped with scars. Rope burns, a faded white line across his left forearm that might have been a knife. His hands were the largest she had ever seen on a human being. Calloused, scarred at the knuckles, capable. The hands of a man who had built things from nothing and would build them again if everything he owned burned to the ground tomorrow. His hair was dark brown, pushed back from a sun-weathered face, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds. Not blue, not gray. Something between. Something that shifted depending on the light. The way the sky shifts before a squall. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his head, sweat-stained at the band, and his jaw was square and stubbled and set in an expression that suggested he had weighed the world and found it adequate but not impressive. To his left stood a man built from the same bloodline but assembled with a different hand. Slightly shorter, though still well over 6 feet, with chestnut brown hair and eyes the color of good whiskey held up to firelight. Where the first man was granite, this one was heartwood, warm, dense, strong in a way that did not announce itself. He held his hat in one hand, and his posture was looser than his brother's, more open, as if he had decided long ago that the world was worth leaning toward rather than bracing against. His gaze found Eliza's face and stayed there, and she saw in it not curiosity, not pity, but a steady, focused attention. The look of a man who reads a sentence 3 times before he turns the page. To the right stood the youngest. She knew he was the youngest, the way you know which horse in a team is the one that will bolt if the harness breaks. Something in the set of his jaw, something in the way he held his weight forward on the balls of his feet coiled ready. Auburn hair catching copper in the sun, eyes the color of dark honey, a bruise fading on one cheekbone, and his knuckles split and scabbed in a way that suggested the bruise had not been received without reply. He looked at Eliza, looked at the empty platform, looked at the closed ticket window, and looked back at Eliza with an expression that was equal parts assessment and challenge. 3 brothers, 3 mountain men, 3 walls of muscle-scarred tissue in silence standing on a depot platform in Montana territory as if they had been placed there by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. The tallest one spoke first. "You waiting on someone, ma'am?" His voice was low, unhurried, measured. The kind of voice that does not waste words because it understands that words once spoken cannot be retrieved. Eliza's voice came out steadier than she expected. "It appears I have been left behind." The 3 men exchanged a look. It lasted less than a second, but it carried the weight of an entire conversation. A language of glances and micro-expressions that only develops between people who have known each other from birth, who have shared meals and grief and labor and silence, until the boundary between one mind and the next becomes porous. The auburn-haired one broke the silence. "You the mail-order bride Crane sent for." The heat that rushed to Eliza's face was immediate and searing. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to claim she was a traveler, a visitor, someone passing through on her way to somewhere that actually wanted her. But lying requires energy, and Eliza had none left. And these 3 men were looking at her with an intensity that suggested lies would not last long in their presence. She said. The past tense tasted like ashes. "Mr. Crane found me unsuitable. Apparently looking around an unfamiliar town and asking why I was made to wait 3 hours was evidence of an unacceptable temperament. Something shifted in the youngest one's face. Not a smile, the ghost of one. The way a match flickers in the instant before it catches flame. "Crane is a fool," he said, and he said it with the casual certainty of a man commenting on the color of the sky. I appreciate the sentiment, Eliza managed. It is not sentiment, the tallest one said. It is fact. His storm-colored eyes moved from her face to her trunk to the empty platform and back again. She watched a calculation happen behind those eyes. Quick and thorough, the way a man calculates the load-bearing capacity of a beam before he trusts it with the weight of a roof. He looked at his brothers. The whiskey-eyed one nodded so slightly that Eliza might have imagined it. The auburn-haired one shrugged one massive shoulder, which apparently meant agreement. The tallest one turned back to her. Name is Silas Calloway. These are my brothers, Gideon and Boone. We run the Elkhorn Ranch about 6 miles north up against the mountains. He paused. The pause felt heavy with something unsaid. We have a wagon outside. I could take you to the boarding house if you want time to figure things out. The depot door banged open. Emmett stuck his head out, his tobacco-stained fingers gripping the door frame. Eastbound leaves at 8 tomorrow morning, Miss Hartwell. Mr. Crane already paid for the ticket. Best be here early. Train does not wait. The words hit Eliza like a slap delivered in public. Mr. Crane already paid. As if she were a package being returned at the sender's expense. As if the transaction, her life, her future, her 2,500-mile journey, her sister's medicine, her aunt's rent, every calculation she had made, and every prayer she had swallowed could be undone with a refund and a schedule. Something hardened inside her, not broke, hardened. The way clay hardens in a kiln transformed by heat from something soft and shapeable into something with edges and permanence, something that could cut. She turned to Emmett. You may tell Mr. Crane that I appreciate his generosity with other people's lives. Emmett raised his eyebrows but said nothing. He retreated inside like a turtle pulling into its shell. Silas Calloway was watching her with an expression she could not read. Not admiration exactly, recognition. The look of a man who understands what it feels like to have your back against a wall and still refuse to kneel. Thank you, Mr. Calloway, Eliza said. I would appreciate a ride to the boarding house. Silas nodded. He bent and gripped the handle of her trunk with one hand. Gideon stepped forward and took the other end. Together they lifted it as if it weighed nothing at all, as if everything Eliza owned in the world was light as feathers, light as the promises that had brought her here and the hopes that had just been shattered on this platform like a cup dropped on stone. Boone fell into step beside her, positioning himself between Eliza and the street with an instinct that seemed entirely unconscious. The instinct of a man who guards without being asked, without being thanked, without even realizing he is doing it. They had taken 3 steps when Silas stopped. He stopped mid-stride and his shoulders squared, and he turned back toward Emmett, who was watching from the ticket window with the undisguised fascination of a man witnessing something he would retell at the saloon that evening. Emmett, Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the way a voice carries across open land. Clear, deliberate, meant to be heard by everyone within range and several people beyond it. If anyone comes asking, our wife will be staying at the Elkhorn from now on. Eliza's breath stopped in her chest. Our wife, not his wife, not a wife. Our wife, I beg your pardon, she said. Her voice was ice. Silas met her eyes. He did not flinch. He did not smile. He did not look like a man who had just said something outrageous. He looked like a man who had done the arithmetic and arrived at the only answer that balanced. Just giving you options, Miss Hartwell, he said quietly. You can still take that train tomorrow. Or you could consider a different arrangement. Gideon stepped forward. His voice was softer than his elder brother's, but carried the same weight, the same seriousness, the same quality of meaning every word and being prepared to stand behind it until the ground gave way. What Silas means is that we need help at the ranch, a woman's presence, a partner in the household. In exchange, you would have a roof, food protection, and a place to belong. No one would bother you. No one would pressure you. And if you ever wish to leave, we would put you on that train ourselves. Boone from behind her in a voice that crackled with something young and fierce. And we would look you in the eye while we said goodbye. Unlike some people, Eliza's mind raced. Her pulse hammered in her temples. She had been standing on this platform for less than an hour, and already one man had rejected her, and three more were claiming her. The absurdity of it should have made her laugh. Instead, it made her furious. "You do not know me," she said, her voice low and sharp as a blade drawn from a sheath. "We have exchanged fewer than 20 sentences, and you are announcing to the station master that I am your wife. All three of you." Silas answered without hesitation, and his voice held no apology and no doubt. "I know you traveled 2,500 miles on faith. I know you were rejected by a man who did not have the courage to look you in the eye. And I know you are standing here with your chin up instead of crying, which tells me more about your character than 20 sentences ever could." Gideon gently, "We are not asking you to love us, Miss Hartwell. We are asking you to let us give you a choice you did not have 5 minutes ago." Boone said nothing, but when Eliza turned to look at him, she saw something in his amber eyes that surprised her. Not calculation, not eagerness, hope, raw and unguarded and hastily hidden behind his bravado like a candle flame cupped in the palms of a man standing in the wind. The hope of someone who has been waiting for something he could not name and has just seen it step off a train. What exactly would this arrangement involve? Eliza heard herself ask, and the voice that asked it sounded like it belonged to someone braver than she felt. Silas set down his end of the trunk. He faced her fully, and she noticed for the first time that all three of them had the same calloused, scarred hands. Built by the same labor, shaped by the same land, meals cooked, household managed, the ranch kept in order. His voice was steady, factual, the voice of a man laying out the terms of a contract he intends to honor to the letter. In exchange, a roof over your head, food on your table, and our protection. All three of us. Gideon added the words that mattered most. He stepped forward, and his whiskey-colored eyes held hers, with a warmth that cut through the cold of her situation the way sunlight cuts through ice on a creek in early spring. "As for anything else, that would be entirely up to you. We are not looking to force anything on anyone. This is your decision, every part of it. And if I wish to leave, Eliza asked. Then we will drive you to the station ourselves," Silas said. Boone added with the first full smile she had seen from any of them, a crooked, lopsided grin that transformed his hard face into something almost boyish, though we would hope you would give the Elkhorn a fair chance first. Eliza looked at each of them in turn. Silas, the eldest, with his storm eyes and his careful reserve, and the weight of responsibility on his shoulders like a yoke he had worn so long, it had become part of his skeleton. Gideon, the middle one, with his warmth and his open hands, and the quiet intelligence that moved behind his gentle expression, like a river running deep beneath a calm surface. Boone, the youngest, with his fire and his bruised knuckles, and the hope he was trying so hard to hide behind a wall of bravado that was not nearly as thick as he believed. She thought of Nell. She thought of the $12 in her pocket. She thought of the eastbound train and the life of factory wages and secondhand shame waiting for her in Boston. She thought of Jasper Crane's letter and the cowardice of a man who could not face the woman he had summoned across a continent. Then she thought of the sky, this impossible sky pressing down on everything, holding the land in place, promising nothing except that it would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, the only honest thing she had encountered since stepping off the train. "Very well," she said. Her voice was calm, though her heart was a drum being struck by a fist. "I accept your offer of employment. As for the other matter, I believe we should maintain propriety before making any declarations." Silas nodded. Something eased in his posture, a tension she had not noticed until it released the way you do not notice the weight of a stone in your pocket until you set it down. Gideon smiled. A real smile, warm and relieved, and it transformed his weathered face the way dawn transforms a valley. Boone's crooked grin widened. "Fair enough," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like gratitude, almost like prayer. Silas lifted the trunk again. Turn to Emmett. Best let folks know Miss Hartwell has found suitable arrangements. Would not want Crane thinking he can change his mind. Emmett nodded slowly, his eyes moving from Silas to Gideon, to Boone, to Eliza and back again, with the shrewd, unhurried assessment of a man who has watched this town's dramas unfold for 30 years and knows a good one when he sees it. Sure thing, Calloway. I will tell folks your wife arrived safe. Eliza flinched at the word wife but said nothing. There would be time to sort the language later. Right now, she needed to get off this platform before her composure cracked like ice on a pond in March all at once and in every direction. The wagon was sturdy, built for mountain roads, hitched to two bay draft horses that stamped and blew in the afternoon sun. Working horses. Not pretty. Powerful. The kind of animals that pull stumps and haul timber and do not care about the weather because the weather is not their problem. Silas climbed onto the driver's bench and took the reins. Eliza sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, her face composed into an expression that gave away nothing. Gideon settled into the wagon bed behind them, his long legs stretched across the floor, one hand resting on the trunk as if he had taken personal responsibility for its safety. Boone rode alongside on a sorrel mare, sitting his saddle with the fluid ease of a man who had learned to ride before he learned to spell his own name. They rode in silence for the first mile. The land opened around them like a book being spread flat on a table. Rolling hills covered in sage and dry grass, clusters of cottonwood trees along creek beds, their leaves catching the wind and flashing silver and green. The mountains ahead, growing with every turn of the wheels, their slopes dark with pine, their peaks still holding the last stubborn patches of snow that refused to acknowledge the calendar's claim that winter was over. The air smelled of things Eliza had no names for. Pine resin, warm earth, the mineral tang of distant snow, the green living smell of water running over stone. She breathed it in and felt something shift in her chest, some knot loosening that she had not known was there. "You have questions," Silas said. It was not a question. "I have approximately 100 of them. Start with the ones that matter most. Why? Why me? You could hire a housekeeper from town. You could send away for your own mail-order bride if you wanted one. Why offer this to a woman you found stranded at a train depot?" Silas was quiet for a time. The horses' hooves kept their steady rhythm on the packed earth, and the wheels creaked, and the wind moved through the sage on either side of the road, and the mountains waited ahead with the patience of things that have been waiting for 10,000 years and are prepared to wait for 10,000 more. Several reasons, he said finally. First, the practical one. There is a man named Virgil Thorne who runs the bank in Silver Creek. He has been trying to push us off our land for 3 years. He wants the water rights on Bear Creek, which runs through our property. Best water source in the valley. Thorne needs it for the cattle operation he is building across the territory. He cannot simply take it, Eliza said. No, but he can make life difficult enough that lesser men would sell. He has been telling people the Elkhorn is a failing operation. 3 unmarried brothers, no family, no future, no permanence. If we have a wife, a household, that story falls apart. A family with a working ranch looks established. Looks like something that will be here in 10 years. Harder to bully, harder to starve out. So I am a strategic asset, Eliza said. Silas winced. That is the practical reason. From behind them, Gideon's voice came quiet and thoughtful, the voice of a man who chooses his words the way a carpenter chooses his timber. Carefully, knowing each one will bear weight. There is another reason. I watched you read that letter. You read it 3 times, and each time you read it, you stood a little straighter. Most people receiving news like that would crumble. You did not. You turned the pain into something you could use. He paused. The Elkhorn needs that kind of strength. We have been managing alone for too long, and it shows. Boone from horseback, the wind carrying his voice like a flag. And Crane is a fool. That is reason number 3. A woman who speaks her mind is not a problem. A man who cannot handle it is the problem. Eliza let their words sit between them, weighing their sincerity the way she had spent her entire adult life weighing the words of men, listening for false notes, detecting the gap between what people say and what they mean. She had become skilled at this out of necessity, the way a person living near a river becomes skilled at reading current and knowing which water is safe to cross and which will pull you under. She could not find a lie in any of their voices. "Tell me about Jasper Crane," she said. Silas's jaw tightened. Crane came to Silver Creek about 4 years ago with money nobody could account for. Bought up land. Bought up. Started lending money to small ranchers during the drought. When they could not pay him back, he took their property. He owns 3 ranches now that used to belong to good families. He is Thorne's partner, the muscle to Thorne's brain. And your ranch, ours is the one they cannot get their hands on. We never borrowed from Crane, never owed Thorne a cent. Our father built the Elkhorn from nothing. He worked the silver mines because the ranch could not feed 4 mouths. When the mine collapsed, Silas paused, not for effect, for survival. The way a man pauses when he is walking across ice and feels it shift beneath him. I was 19. Gideon was 15. Boone was 12. I spent years working as a hired hand, saved every dollar, bought out the remaining shares from the Garrett family when the influenza took their men. We did not come this far to hand it to men like Crane and Thorne. Gideon softly. None of us did. Boone said nothing. But the set of his jaw, the angle of his shoulders, the way his hands held the reins, all of it spoke a language that words could not improve upon. The language of a man who has drawn a line and will die on it. Eliza felt something shift inside her, a recognition that went deeper than circumstance, deeper than sympathy, down to the bedrock of shared experience. These men were not just ranchers defending a piece of ground. They were brothers defending something they had built from grief and loss, and years of labor were so punishing, it had scarred their hands and their hearts in equal measure. She knew that arithmetic. She had lived it. Every stitch she had sewn in the garment factory, every penny she had counted and recounted, every night she had lain awake calculating how many weeks of Nell's medicine they could afford before the money ran out. It was the same equation, the equation of people who cannot afford to lose. "You should have told me all of this at the depot," she said. "Would it have changed your answer?" Silas asked. "No, but I do not like learning the full picture in pieces. If we are going to have an arrangement, I need you to be completely honest with me. All 3 of you, about everything." The 3 brothers responded in unison, each in his own way. Silas with a single deliberate dip of his chin, Gideon with a gentle tilt of his head and a softening around his eyes, Boone with a sharp jerk that conveyed both agreement and something that might have been impatience with the idea that anyone would expect less. "That is fair," Silas said, "and we will be. A promise given by a man is all he has," he added after a moment, and the words had the weight of something he had said before many times to himself and to his brothers, a compass heading by which he navigated the unmapped territory of his life. The wagon crested a low rise and Elkhorn Ranch appeared below them. Eliza saw a house, 2 stories of rough-hewn timber, larger than she had expected, with a wide front porch and stone chimneys rising from both ends like sentinels. A barn stood nearby its doors, open to the evening air, and she could hear the sounds of animals inside, the low conversation of horses, the shuffling of hooves on straw. A corral held a dozen more horses, their coats catching the last light. Outbuildings scattered across the yard in a pattern that suggested growth over time. Not planned, accumulated. The way a life accumulates possessions and purpose and the small daily evidence of persistence. And beyond it all, Bear Creek. She heard it before she saw it. A sound like silk being drawn across stone. Then there it was, threading through the valley floor, catching the sunset and throwing it back in fragments of silver and gold. It was beautiful. It was raw. It was nothing like Boston. Silas pulled the horses to a stop at the top of the rise. He did not speak. He just let her look, giving her time the way you give time to someone standing at the edge of a decision they cannot unmake. It is not, Boston, Eliza said after a long silence. No. Silas agreed. From behind them, Gideon's voice quiet and certain and full of something Eliza would later recognize as love so deep it had become indistinguishable from the land itself. It is better. A man emerged from the barn as the wagon descended toward the house, lean, graying, around 55 with a rifle in his hands, and the kind of eyes that have seen enough trouble to stop being surprised by any of it. He lowered the rifle when he recognized the wagon but did not set it aside. His gaze sharpened like a blade being drawn across a strop when it found Eliza on the bench beside Silas. "Who is this?" he asked. His voice was sandpaper and smoke. "Eliza Hartwell," Silas said, climbing down. "She will be staying at the Elkhorn." "Staying how long?" "That depends on her." The lean man studied Eliza the way a man studies a horse he has been asked to trust, looking for signs of panic, skittishness, weakness. The thousand small tells that separate an animal you can depend on from one that will bolt at the first crack of thunder. Eliza stepped down from the wagon without waiting for anyone to help her. Her boots hit the hard, packed earth, and the impact traveled up through her legs and into her spine, and she felt it like a verdict. This ground, this place, this moment. She extended her hand. "Mr. Perkins, I presume. I appreciate you not shooting us." The lean man blinked. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He looked at the three Calloway brothers standing behind her like a mountain range in human form. Something shifted in his weathered expression. The first hairline crack in a wall that had taken decades to build. He shook her hand. The grip was firm and brief and calloused. "Heck, Perkins," he said, and he almost smiled. "Almost. You the bride Crane sent for the one he sent back," Eliza corrected. "There is a difference." Heck looked at Silas, then at Gideon, then at Boone. A long, loaded silence passed between the four men, the kind of wordless conversation that only develops between people who have survived hard seasons together and know each other's minds the way they know the contours of the land they work. "Kitchen is a wreck," Heck said, finally turning toward the barn. "Just so you know." He was not wrong. The inside of the house hit Eliza like a confession. Dishes stacked in the basin, crusted with food that might once have been identifiable, but had since evolved into something best described as archaeological. A table buried under papers, leather scraps, horseshoe nails, tin cups, and what appeared to be the disassembled components of a bridal. The floor had not been swept in a period of time that Eliza chose not to calculate because the answer would only make her angry. A bookshelf held 36 volumes coated in dust, so thick you could write your name in it. The fireplace was cold, full of ash, and home to what she suspected was a family of mice. She stood in the doorway and said nothing for 10 full seconds. Behind her, three enormous men shifted their weight with the uncomfortable silence of boy caught tracking mud across a clean floor, if any floor in this house had ever been clean, which she was beginning to doubt. "I did mention we needed a housekeeper," Silas offered. "You mentioned it. You did not prepare me for the scale of the emergency." She turned to face them. All three, standing in a row, the largest men she had ever seen, and not one of them capable of washing a dish. "Where is my room?" Gideon led her down a narrow hallway to a small room at the back of the house. It was half filled with wooden crates, coils of rope, a saddle that needed mending, and what appeared to be the dismantled components of a fence gate leaning against the wall. A narrow bed was pushed against the far side. On the mattress sat a folded quilt, freshly placed, the creases still sharp as if someone had put it there recently, in a hurry, as if he had known somehow that he might be bringing someone home today. "I will clear this tomorrow," Gideon said. "First thing, did you plan this?" Eliza asked sharply. "Going to the depot. Did you know Crane was going to reject me?" "No, ma." Silas went to pick up fencing wire. Emmett told him what happened when he walked in. The rest was decided in about 30 seconds. Gideon's mouth curved just slightly, just enough to transform his serious face into something approaching warmth. Silas makes fast decisions. It is both his greatest strength and his most terrifying quality. Despite everything, despite the dust and the disorder and the sheer improbability of her situation, Eliza almost smiled. Almost. I will take the room, she said, and I will start earning my keep tonight. You do not have to. I know I do not have to. I want to. If I am going to sleep under this roof, I will contribute to it before I close my eyes. She pulled the pins from her bonnet and hung it on a nail by the door. She rolled up her sleeves to the elbows, exposing forearms that were stronger than they looked, toughened by years of pushing fabric through industrial sewing machines for 12 hours at a stretch. Where do you keep your flour? She said. It was not a question. She cooked the first meal with her jaw set and her sleeves rolled, and a focus so complete it transformed the chaos of the kitchen into something orderly by sheer force of will. Beans, salt pork, cornbread from flour she sifted twice to remove the worst of the weevils. There are always weevils. She had said it to no one and everyone, and from the hallway she had heard Boone mutter to Gideon, "Did she just accept weevils as a fact of life?" And Gideon's quiet reply, "I believe she did, and something about that exchange made her feel for the first time since stepping off the train that she was standing on solid ground." The meal was not elegant. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be hot and ready and irrefutable proof that Eliza Hartwell was worth keeping. When the four men came in from the evening chores, three brothers and one old ranch hand, they stopped in the doorway. The table was cleared of debris, wiped clean, and set with plates. The fire was lit, and the room was warm, and the smell of food filled a house that had clearly forgotten what that smell meant. Heck Perkins sat down without a word and ate with the quiet, reverent concentration of a man rediscovering something he had lost and mourned and never expected to find again. Boone ate with the velocity and enthusiasm of a young man who treats food as fuel for the fire that is always burning inside him. Gideon ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite as if he wanted to remember it, his whiskey-brown eyes moving from the cornbread to the beans to the woman who had produced them from a kitchen that had been a disaster area 2 hours before. Silas ate in silence. His storm-gray eyes moved from the clean table to the floor, to the crackling fire, to Eliza's face, and she watched him cataloging each change the way he cataloged everything. Quietly, thoroughly, filing it away for future consideration. "This is the best thing I have eaten in 6 months," Boone announced through a mouthful of cornbread. "Possibly in my entire life." "Do not talk with your mouth full," Eliza said. The words came out automatically, the reflexive correction of a woman who had spent years raising a younger sister, and the moment they left her mouth, she heard them land in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Boone's amber eyes widened. He swallowed. Then the crooked grin broke across his face, wide and delighted, and so completely disarming that Eliza felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Open. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Heck caught Eliza's eye across the table. For the first time since her arrival, the old ranch hand looked at her, not with assessment or suspicion, but with something that might, in a very guarded man, who had been alone for a very long time, pass for approval. That night alone in her small room, with the crates pushed to one side and the quilt pulled to her chin, and the sounds of an unfamiliar house settling around her in the darkness, Eliza sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her hands together until her knuckles went white. She did not cry, but she allowed herself in the privacy of that dark room to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she had been Eliza Hartwell of Boston, a mail-order bride on her way to meet the man who would be her husband. Now she was Eliza Hartwell, of nowhere in particular, living in a stranger's house, wearing a name she had not earned, playing a role in a story she had not written. She pulled Jasper Crane's letter from the pocket of her dress and read it one final time. Too plain spoken. Too willful for a proper bride. She folded it carefully. She walked to the stove in the hallway where the Coals from dinner still glowed red behind the iron grate. She opened the door. She fed the letter to the fire and watched it curl and blacken and shrink and finally silently disappear. Then she went back to her room and closed the door. And in the darkness, in a house that smelled of wood smoke and pine, and the faint ghost of cornbread surrounded by mountains she could not see but could feel pressing against the sky like the walls of a cathedral, Eliza Hartwell slept more soundly than she had in months. Sometimes life delivers you to exactly where you need to be. It just uses a road you never would have chosen. She did not know it yet, but the road had only just begun. The next 2 weeks remade Eliza Hartwell the way a forge remakes iron, through heat, through pressure, through the relentless hammering of one day against the next, until the shape of her life bore no resemblance to the shape it had held before. She attacked the Elkhorn the way a general attacks a battlefield, with strategy, determination, and absolutely no mercy. She rose before dawn on her second morning, while the house was still dark and the only sounds were the creak of the walls and the breathing of the men sleeping behind their closed doors. And she started with the kitchen because the kitchen was the heart and the heart was failing. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees with a brush she found in the barn and lye soap she made herself from ash and tallow, working the bristles into the wood until the grain emerged from beneath years of grime like a face emerging from beneath a mask. She scraped the dishes. She organized the pantry, throwing out food that had gone past saving tins with no labels, flour thick with weevils beyond redemption, salt pork that had turned a color not found in nature. She created an inventory of what remained and posted it on the wall in handwriting, so precise it looked like printed text. She washed every window. She beat the dust from every rug until Heck Perkins appeared in the doorway and informed her in his sandpaper voice that the horses were getting nervous. She found a loose hinge on the pantry door on the third day and fixed it herself using a screwdriver and a spare hinge that Heck showed her how to set. She mended every curtain in the house. She swept the fireplaces and cleaned the flues and reorganized the bookshelf, discovering in the process that Gideon Calloway had annotated the margins of nearly every volume with notes in a small, careful hand. Observations about plants, questions about soil, lines of poetry copied from other sources and tucked between the pages like pressed flowers. The house resisted her at first, the way all old things resist change, settling back into its disorder, like a dog returning to a favorite patch of mud. But Eliza was more stubborn than the house. She had been more stubborn than poverty, more stubborn than a factory that wanted 12 hours of her life for $11 a week, more stubborn than a sister's illness and a continent's worth of distance and a man who rejected her through a window. The Elkhorn did not stand a chance, but it was not the house that transformed her, it was the men. Each of the three Calloway brothers occupied a different space in the rhythm of the ranch, and as Eliza wove herself into that rhythm, she began to understand them not as a unit, but as three distinct hearts beating at three distinct tempos inside the body of a single family. Gideon found her first. It was the third morning. She had finished the kitchen and was standing at the edge of a fenced patch of earth behind the house, staring at what had once been a vegetable garden and was now a graveyard. The fence posts were gray with age, leaning at drunken angles. The soil was cracked and pale as old bone. Weeds had long since won whatever war had been fought here, and were now ruling the territory with the casual authority of victors who no longer remember what they conquered. "This used to grow food," she said. Gideon came to stand beside her. He moved quietly for a man his size with a deliberateness that made his presence feel like a choice rather than an intrusion. Where his older brother was granite and his younger brother was gunpowder, Gideon was heartwood, dense, warm, strong in a way that did not need to announce itself. 3 years ago, he said, before the drought, before we stopped having time for anything but cattle and fence line and keeping the ranch from going under. Can it grow again? He knelt. He took a handful of soil and lifted it to his face, rolling it between his fingers, studying its texture the way a man studies a letter from someone he has not heard from in a long time. Then he held it to his nose and breathed in, and Eliza watched his eyes close for just a moment. And when they opened, there was something in them that looked like hope. The soil is not dead, he said, just tired, needs compost, needs water, needs someone who will show up every day. I will show up every day, Eliza said. He looked up at her, squinting against the morning light, and something passed between them. Not attraction, not yet. Something quieter. The recognition of two people who understand patience, who know that the things worth having are the things that take time. Then I will teach you, Gideon said. My mother kept a garden when we were boys. She grew herbs, tomatoes, squash. She said the secret was stubbornness. I have that in abundance, Eliza said. Jasper Crane can confirm. Gideon laughed, a short, surprised sound that broke from him like a bird startled from a bush, warm and genuine and so unexpected that they both seemed surprised by it. From that moment, their alliance was sealed. They worked the garden together every morning before the heat became punishing. Gideon knelt in the dirt beside her and taught her to read the soil the way he read his books. Color, texture, what it craved and what it had too much of. He taught her about water, how to direct it where it mattered, how to make every drop count in a land that treated water like gold. Winter always ends, Gideon said one morning, pressing a seedling into the earth with his broad, gentle hands. Soil always remembers how to grow. And slowly, reluctantly, the garden responded. Green shoots appeared where there had been only dust. Tiny, defiant threads of life pushing up through cracked earth as if they had been waiting for permission. Eliza felt a fierce, irrational pride in every leaf. She understood the metaphor. She did not need anyone to spell it out. It was in those mornings kneeling in the dirt beside Gideon Calloway that Eliza began to understand the middle brother. He was the reader, the thinker, the one who kept the library stocked and knew the name of every bird that nested on their land. He read everything: history, botany, novels, old newspapers, anything with words on a page. And when Eliza reorganized his bookshelf, arranging the volumes by subject, and discovering a worn copy of Cooper's Leather-Stocking Tales with Gideon's notes in every margin, something shifted between them. You've been reading my books, he said one evening, finding her curled in the chair by the fire with the novel open in her lap, and the lamplight turning her honey-blonde hair to gold. You have been ignoring them, she replied without looking up. Someone should. It is a good story, though Cooper's women could use more backbone. Agreed, Eliza said, and their eyes met over the open page, and the lamplight turned his whiskey-brown irises into something warm and golden. And Eliza felt a stirring in her chest that she carefully, deliberately filed away for later examination. Silas was harder to reach. He operated at a distance, not cold, guarded. The way a man is guarded when he has spent 14 years making every decision for a family and trusts no one else to carry the weight. He thanked Eliza for meals. He acknowledged the changes she had made to the house. He was courteous in the way that mountains are courteous, present, unmovable, offering no warmth but blocking the wind. Eliza cornered him in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after her arrival. She had been studying the ranch's operations through observation, through conversations with Heck and Gideon, and through careful attention to the papers scattered across Silas's workspace. Supply orders, cattle tallies, weather logs, and a leather-bound ledger that she suspected contained the ranch's financial records. I want to see the book, she said. Silas looked up from the harness he was mending. The storm in his eyes was neither inviting nor forbidding. It was waiting. What books? The financial ledger, the ranch accounts, supply costs, cattle revenue, outstanding debts. All of it. Why? Because I cannot manage a household I do not understand. I am not a decoration, Silas. If I am going to live here and help you keep this ranch, I need to understand the operation. The cattle, the finances, the water rights. She held his gaze without flinching. I did not travel 2,500 miles to be kept in the dark. Silas stared at her for a long moment. The silence stretched between them like a rope being tested for strength. Then slowly he reached beneath the table and drew out the leather ledger. He slid it across the surface toward her. Most women would not ask for that, he said. Most women were not rejected by Jasper Crane for being too plain-spoken. I intend to make that quality an asset rather than a liability. The corner of Silas's mouth moved. Not a smile, the geological precursor to a smile. The first tremor before the ground shifts. It lasted less than a second, but it transformed his face just long enough for Eliza to see the man beneath the granite. She opened the ledger and read it the way she read everything that mattered. 3 times. Thoroughly. Missing nothing. Within an hour, she had identified 3 places where the ranch was bleeding money. A supplier in Cheyenne charging 15% above the market rate for feed. A standing order that had been duplicated for 3 consecutive months, meaning the Elkhorn had been paying double for salt and cornmeal since autumn. And a tax assessment on the property that appeared to have been calculated with numbers that favored Virgil Thorne's bank rather than any honest arithmetic. She presented her findings to Silas at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, and her finger pointing to each discrepancy with the precision of a surgeon indicating the location of a bullet. Silas sat back in his chair. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. And Eliza watched an expression cross his face that she would come to know well. Surprise followed by respect, followed by the slow, grudging recognition that he had been outmatched. I married the smartest woman in the territory, he said. The word hung between them. Married, warm and heavy, and entirely unplanned. He cleared his throat. That is, the arrangement. You understand. I understand perfectly, Eliza said. She did not smile, but something in her softened toward Silas Calloway in that moment. The recognition that beneath his granite was a man who had been carrying too much for too long and had just realized, perhaps for the first time, that he did not have to carry it alone. Boone was the easiest to read and the hardest to help. He wore his emotions the way other men wore their hats, constantly, publicly, and with a tilt that suggested he did not particularly care who noticed. Within the first week, Eliza understood 3 things about the youngest Calloway. He would die for his brothers without hesitation. He would fight any man who looked at Eliza sideways. And beneath his fire lay a deep, cold fear that he was the least necessary member of the family. She discovered this on the evening of the fence mending. Boone had been working the south fence line alone for 2 days, repairing damage from a fallen pine, and he came in after dark with his hands torn raw from barbed wire. The bandage he had wrapped around his right palm was a masterwork of incompetence, already soaked through and coming loose at every edge. Silas said nothing about it. The work had needed doing. Gideon offered to clean the cuts. Boone waved him off with a grunt that tried to sound tough and came out exhausted. Eliza waited until the others had gone to bed. She filled a basin with warm water, set it on the kitchen table, and sat down across from where Boone was nursing his last cup of coffee. Give me your hands. They are fine. They are bleeding through a bandage you wrapped with the skill of a blindfolded child. Give me your hands. Boone looked at her. For a moment, his amber eyes, so like Silas's in intensity and so different in everything they held, showed something unguarded, something young, something that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with the ashes that fire leaves behind. He extended his hands across the table, palms up. Eliza took them. She cleaned the cuts carefully, gently, with a practiced touch that came from years of mending fabric and occasionally mending the fingers that pushed it through the machines. She wrapped them properly. And without looking up, she said the words that would change her relationship with Boone Calloway forever. You do not have to prove yourself to them, Boone. They already know your worth. The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear the fire crackling in the other room and the wind pressing against the walls outside and the beating of her own heart. Sometimes I am not so sure about that. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with dust or coffee. It was the voice of a boy who had lost his father at 12 years old and spent 13 years trying to fill shoes that were never meant for a child's feet. Eliza looked up and met his eyes. Then let me be sure for you until you can be sure for yourself. Boone's jaw worked. He pulled his hands back gently and stood. At the doorway, he stopped without turning around. "You are nothing like what Crane described in those letters," he said. "You are better." He described a woman he could manage. "You are a woman who cannot be managed." He paused. "That is not an insult." I did not take it as one. He walked out into the dark, and Eliza sat alone at the table with the basin of reddened water and the understanding that she had just seen inside Boone Calloway's chest. And what she found there was not fire but fear. The fear of the youngest. The fear of the expendable one. The fear that love, if it must be rationed, that will run out before it reaches him. She would not let that happen. 3 weeks after her arrival, the Callaways took Eliza to town. They rode into Silver Creek on the wagon, Eliza in her navy blue dress pressed and mended and brushed until it looked almost new. Silas drove. Gideon sat behind them. Boone rode his sorrel mare alongside. And the four of them looked, Eliza realized with a start, exactly like what they were pretending to be. A family. The first test came outside the Buckhorn Saloon. A heavy-set man with a face the color of raw beef leaned against the porch railing and called across the street in a voice built for carrying insults over long distances. "Calloway boys. Heard you picked up Crane's reject and decided to share her around." Three things happened simultaneously. Boone was off the mare before Eliza could draw a breath, crossing the street with his fists already balling. Silas's hands went white on the reins, his entire body going rigid, the way a bridge goes rigid before it either holds or snaps. Gideon placed one hand on Eliza's arm, not restraining, steadying. Eliza stood up on the wagon bench, all 5 feet 3 inches of her, and her voice rang out across the street of Silver Creek, Montana territory with a clarity that stopped every conversation and turned every head within 100 yards. "I was not rejected, sir. I was liberated from a man of remarkably poor judgment. And I would suggest you choose your next words with great care when speaking about a lady or about the men who had the decency to offer her a choice when your friend Mr. Crane could not even manage a conversation." Silence. The kind of silence that falls on a room when something has just happened that everyone present will remember and retell for years. The heavy-set man's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. Boone froze in mid-stride in the middle of the street with murder in his eyes, turned slowly to look at Eliza. The expression on his face was pure, undiluted, worshipful astonishment. He looked like a man who has just watched a kitten knock down a bull. "Well," he said, "never mind then." He walked back to the wagon, mounted his horse, and said nothing else for 10 minutes, though the grin on his face suggested he was composing a ballad in his head. Inside the general store, the proprietor, a thin, bespectacled man named Howell, leaned across the counter and spoke to Eliza in a voice low enough for privacy, but warm enough for sincerity. "Crane is a mean-spirited fool, Mrs. Calloway. You have landed with good men. Best in the valley, some would say." At the dressmaker's shop, Agnes Pennington, broad-shouldered and kind-eyed and in possession of opinions she did not bother to soften, declared at full volume that Jasper Crane would not know a quality woman if she served him tea in the parlor. "You tell those Calloway boys I said they are the 3 smartest men in Montana territory." The encounter Eliza had been dreading came outside the post office. Virgil Thorne stood on the steps, tall, well-dressed, polished the way a new coin is polished, all surface and no depth. He looked at Eliza the way a banker looks at collateral, assessing value, calculating risk, running numbers behind eyes that held the warmth of a January river. "Calloway," he said. His voice was pleasant the way a razor is pleasant, smooth and thin and capable of drawing blood before you realize you have been cut. "I do not believe I have had the pleasure." Silas's posture changed, a squaring of the shoulders, a shift in weight. Beside her, Gideon moved to her left. Boone appeared at her right. The 3 brothers formed a wall around Eliza without a word or a signal, A maneuver so fluid and instinctive that it must have been practiced in 1,000 smaller moments across 1,000 ordinary days. Virgil, this is our wife, Eliza, Silas said. His voice was level, his eyes were not. Eliza, this is Virgil Thorne. He runs the bank. A pleasure, Mrs. Calloway. Thorne extended his hand. Eliza shook it. His grip was cold and precise, the grip of a man who touches people only when it serves a purpose. I had no idea that Callaways were in the market for a wife, Thorne said. Some things do not require a market, Mr. Thorne, Eliza replied. They simply happen. Thorne's smile did not reach his eyes. It did not even attempt the journey. Indeed. Well, I hope you find the Elkhorn to your liking. It is a demanding property. 3 brothers have been struggling with it for some time. The Elkhorn is thriving, Eliza said, but I appreciate your concern. Thorne held her gaze for one beat too long. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, and Eliza watched him go and felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach, like a stone dropped into deep water. This man was dangerous. Not the way Crane was dangerous, which was the danger of stupidity and cowardice. Thorne was the danger of intelligence applied without conscience. The kind of man who dismantles lives with a fountain pen and a filing cabinet, and the patient, methodical cruelty of someone who has all the time in the world. On the ride home, Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Thorne is going to be a problem. He already is a problem, Eliza corrected. He was measuring me, trying to decide whether I make you stronger or weaker. And what conclusion do you think he reached? He has not decided yet, which means we need to make sure he reaches the right one. That evening, after Heck had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch was quiet, Eliza sat on the porch and listened to the silence. Not the silence of Boston, thick with distant noise compressed by the weight of too many people occupying too little space. This was the silence of open country, vast, breathing. The sound of wind through sage and the far-off voice of Bear Creek in the enormous star-filled sky, pressing down on the mountains like a hand holding the world in place. The front door opened behind her, 3 sets of boots on the porch boards. 3 cups of coffee, one placed in her hands by Silas without asking whether she wanted it. They sat together in the darkness. 4 people who had been strangers a month ago and were becoming something else, something they did not yet have a name for. Eliza told them about Nell, about the cough that never stopped, about the blood on the handkerchiefs, about the medicine that cost more than hope, and the doctor who shook his head, and the morning she left Boston with a promise she was terrified she could not keep. Gideon spoke first. You will bring her here. We will make sure of it. The word we settled around Eliza like a blanket in a cold room. A small word, 2 letters, but it held a world inside it. Silas, after a silence so long she thought he would not speak at all. When I saw you read that letter at the depot, you read it 3 times, each time you stood straighter. Most people receiving that kind of news would crumble. You did not. You turned the pain into something useful. He paused. The Elkhorn needs that kind of strength. I need that kind of strength. Boone quietly, from the far end of the porch where he sat with his boots on the railing and his face turned toward the mountains. So do I. Liza looked at the sky, larger than anything she had ever known. Larger than fear, larger than loneliness. This is beginning to feel like home, she said softly. And she felt rather than saw 3 men exhale at the same time, as if they had been holding their breath without knowing it, as if they had been waiting for exactly that word. By the end of that 3rd week, Eliza could not sleep. She had not slept properly since the evening on the porch, since the coffee in the dark, and the word home hanging in the night air, and the terrifying realization that what she felt for these 3 men was not gratitude or obligation or the careful warmth of an arrangement being honored. It was something deeper, something with roots, a different kind of bond with each of them. Gideon's quiet wisdom, Silas's unbreakable steadiness, Boone's fierce, fragile loyalty, and the dawning understanding that she was not choosing between them. She was growing to need all 3. She walked the fence line at first light, trying to exhaust the restlessness out of her body, and that was when she heard the sound. Low, desperate, fading. The bleating of an animal too young and too weak to make any sound at all, and yet making it anyway because that is what living things do when they are dying. They call out. The mother cow lay on her side in the grass already gone. The calf, small and slick and barely hours old, struggled beside her. Its legs folded every time it tried to stand. Its cry was getting weaker. Eliza ran. She did not think about her dress. She did not think about the mud. She dropped to her knees and gathered the calf against her chest and felt the frantic, failing heartbeat through its ribs. The animal was cold, too cold for anything still alive. "Hold on," she whispered. "Just hold on." She carried it to the barn. It weighed almost nothing, and that lightness terrified her more than its silence. Gideon found her 20 minutes later, sitting in the hay with the calf in her lap, trying to drip warm milk into its mouth from a soaked rag. "The mother is gone," she said without looking up. "This one is barely hanging on. It will not take the rag." Gideon knelt beside her and examined the calf with quick, practiced hands. Gums, breathing, the temperature of its ears. His face told Eliza everything his words did not. "It might not make it," he said quietly. "Then we will give it every chance." Her voice was fierce, fiercer than the situation warranted, and they both knew this was not about a calf. This was about Nell, about the years Eliza had spent watching her sister fight for every breath in a room that smelled of medicine and damp walls. About every time someone had told her, sometimes children die, and she had refused, absolutely refused to accept those words as anything other than a challenge. "Get me a bottle," she said. "A real one, not a rag. And heat the milk. Body temperature, not warm." Gideon did not argue. He went to the house. He came back with the bottle. Eliza positioned the calf's head with a gentleness that belied the steel in her jaw and pressed the nipple against its lips. 5 minutes. The calf would not latch. Eliza tried again, adjusted the angle, squeezed one drop of milk onto the calf's tongue. The calf's mouth twitched. Another drop. The tongue moved, weak, uncertain, but moving. One more squeeze. And this time the calf latched on and began to drink. Slowly at first, then with growing urgency, its small body pressing against Eliza as if she were the only solid thing left in its world. Eliza let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years. Gideon sat back on his heels. His whiskey eyes were bright in the dim barn light. "Stronger together," he said softly, almost to himself. But Eliza heard it, and she remembered. "What will you name it?" he asked. "Hope," she said, "because that is what it took." And Gideon looked at her with an expression she did not see because she was watching the calf and not his face. An expression of a man who has just realized something that changes everything, and is both terrified and grateful. The crisis came without warning, the way all real crises come. Tom Colton rode into the Elkhorn at a gallop on a Tuesday morning, his horse lathered white with sweat, his barrel chest heaving, his face the color of sunburn and fury. Callaway. "Rustlers hit my south herd last night. Took 30 head. Tracks lead toward the pass. I need riders." Silas and Boone were saddled in 5 minutes flat. Eliza watched them move with the coordinated efficiency of men who had prepared for this their entire lives. Rifles checked, ammunition pocketed, heavy coats thrown across saddles. Silas spoke to Gideon in the yard, and the exchange was brief and absolute. "Someone stays with Eliza in the ranch. That is not a request." Gideon's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The middle brother understood. Of the three, he was the one whose judgment Silas trusted most in his absence, the one who would keep the ranch running and Eliza safe without needing to be told how. They were gone in a cloud of dust. Silas and Boone and Colton and his men riding hard toward the mountains, and the sound of their hooves faded into the morning air and left a silence that pressed against Eliza's chest like a hand. 3 days, they were gone for 3 days. 3 days during which Eliza discovered what it meant to wait for men you have come to care about. She fed the livestock. She hauled water from Bear Creek. She kept the garden alive. She sat up each night on the porch with a rifle across her knees, the rifle Gideon had taught her to hold in her first week at the Elkhorn. Stock against the shoulder. Finger outside the trigger guard until you are ready to shoot. Breathe, aim, squeeze. Do not pull. Gideon sat with her through the long, dark hours. They talked in the low, honest way that only happens between two people who are awake while the rest of the world sleeps. He told her about his mother who died when Boone was 4, a fever that came in the night and would not leave. He told her about his father, Holt Calloway, who worked the silver mines, because the ranch could not feed 4 mouths, who came home every evening with silver dust in his hair and exhaustion in his bones and in his voice when he read to his boys by the fire. He told her about the day the mine collapsed, about the man who came to the ranch house with his hat in his hands and news that no child should ever have to hear. Eliza told him about her parents, the tenement fire that had taken them both while she was at the factory, the smell of smoke she still caught sometimes in her clothes and her hair and her dreams, the way grief had settled over her life like a season that would not end. On the second night, riders passed on the road beyond the property. Eliza blew out the lamp, pressed her back against the wall, held the rifle the way Gideon had taught her. In the darkness, Gideon moved to the window, his own rifle ready, his body between Eliza and the door. Neither of them spoke. The riders passed. The silence returned. And somewhere in that long, dark hour, Eliza's hand found Gideon's in the blackness, and his fingers closed around hers, and neither of them acknowledged it, and neither of them let go. On the third morning, dust appeared on the horizon. 2 riders. Eliza counted them, counted again. Her stomach dropped like a stone thrown into a well. 2 riders, not 3. 3 men had left. 2 were coming back. She grabbed the rifle and ran to the fence. It was Silas and one of Colton's men. Silas was riding hard, his face drawn tight as a drumhead, and when he pulled up at the gate, Eliza saw something on his face she had never seen there before. Fear. Boone took a bullet, he said. The words came out flat and controlled the way a man speaks when he is using all his strength to keep his voice from breaking. Colton's ranch. He is alive, but he needs stitching, and I need... His voice cracked. Silas Calloway's voice cracked, and the sound of it was more terrifying to Eliza than anything she had heard since stepping off the train in Silver Creek. Go, she said. She was already moving. Already gathering the medical supplies she had organized in the kitchen on her first week. Needle, thread, clean cloth, whiskey for disinfection. I am coming with you, Eliza. I stitched leather in a factory for 3 years, Silas. I can stitch skin. And I am not staying here while one of your brothers bleeds out on someone else's kitchen table. Drive the wagon. Now he did not argue. There was no time to argue and nothing to argue about, and they both knew it. They found Boone on a cot in the Colton Ranch house, pale as milk, sweating through his shirt, a blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his left side, where a bullet had torn through the flesh above his hip. Martha Colton was beside him, pressing clean cloth against the wound with the steady, unsurprised hands of a frontier woman who had seen worse and expected to see worse again. Eliza took one look and took command. She washed her hands. She threaded the needle. She sat beside Boone and looked into his glazed amber eyes and saw beneath the pain and the shock and the sweat the youngest brother looking back at her with an expression that broke something inside her and rebuilt it at the same time. This is going to hurt, she said. Boone managed the ghost of his crooked grin. Everything hurts. You get used to it, no, Eliza said, and her voice was fierce and tender in the same breath, the way a mother's voice is fierce and tender when she is holding together the things she loves most. You do not get used to it. You survive it. There is a difference. She stitched the wound. Her hands did not tremble. Her fingers moved with the speed and precision of a woman who had sewn 10,000 stitches in a factory and could sew 10,000 more. And the fact that this time the fabric was skin and the thread was catgut, and the pattern was a man's life, did not change the fundamental mechanics. Stitch, pull, tie, move to the next one. Silas stood behind her, gripping the door frame so hard the wood creaked under his hands. Gideon, who had arrived on horseback minutes after the wagon, knelt beside the cot and held Boone's hand. The hand that Boone would never have allowed anyone to hold if he had been fully conscious. But consciousness was a shore he was swimming toward and not quite reaching, and in the space between waking and darkness, even the youngest Calloway brother could accept the comfort of being held. Eliza tied the final stitch, looked up at Silas. He will live. The bullet went through clean. No bone, no organ. He needs rest water and someone to stop him from doing anything reckless for at least 3 weeks. That is a full-time job, Gideon said, and his voice was shaking. Then it is a good thing I am here, Eliza said. That night, after the others had settled, Eliza sat beside Boone's bed in the lamplight. He was awake now, lucid, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has been introduced to his own mortality and is still deciding how he feels about the meeting. You saved my life, he said. I stitched a wound. Mrs. Colton kept you alive until I got there. You came for me. His voice was raw. You got it in that wagon and you came. Nobody who was not blood has ever done that. Boone Calloway. Eliza said, and her voice carried an authority that surprised them both, an authority that came from a place deeper than education or temperament, a place where love and fury are the same thing. You are one of the finest men I have ever known. You are brave and loyal, and you love your brothers with a ferocity that takes my breath away. You are not expendable. You are essential. And if I hear you suggest otherwise, again, I will reopen that wound and stitch it worse. Boone stared at her. Something escaped him, a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. He turned his face to the wall. His hand found hers on the blanket and squeezed once hard and then released. You are something else, Eliza Hartwell, he whispered. Calloway, she corrected. And it was the first time she had used the name voluntarily. The first time it felt like it belonged to her. 3 weeks later, Boone was on his feet, and Founders Day came to Silver Creek. The celebration filled the town square with music and lanterns and the smell of roasting meat and the voices of every ranching family in the territory. Eliza wore the navy blue dress altered by Agnes Pennington fitted to her frame. The 3 Calloway brothers stood with her in dark suits, and the sight of them together, 3 massive men flanking one small, luminous woman, stopped conversations across the square. She danced with each of them, with Gideon first slow and natural, as if their bodies had been practicing this without their minds knowing. With Boone next careful of his wound, his hand light on her waist, his eyes bright with a joy that had nothing to do with the fiddle music and everything to do with being alive and upright and holding this woman in his arms. With Silas last. And with Silas, the rest of the world went quiet. He held her close, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. His storm gray eyes were unguarded fully and completely in a way she had never seen before. The armor was gone. The granite was gone. What remained was a man who was tired of being strong alone and had found someone who made the carrying bearable. I have been trying to find the right words, he said quietly. I have never needed words, Silas. Only honesty. Then honestly, Eliza. He drew her closer, and she could feel his heartbeat through his shirt, strong and steady as the mountains that surrounded them. I want you to stay, not as our housekeeper, not as part of an arrangement, as our wife, truly. Before she could answer, a shout split the air like an axe through wood. Jasper Crane was shoving through the crowd. Drunk, furious, his expensive coat rumpled, his face flushed with whiskey, and wounded pride, his finger pointed at Eliza like the barrel of a gun. There she is. The woman who was supposed to be my wife, stolen by the Calloways before she even had the decency to leave town. The crowd went silent. Every head turned. Every voice stopped. Boone stepped forward, his hand dropping toward his hip. Gideon moved to flank. Silas positioned himself between Crane and Eliza, And when he spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that was more dangerous than any shout Crane could produce. You rejected her, Crane. Left her stranded at the depot without a word to her face. What happened after that is none of your concern. Crane staggered closer. I came back for her. The next morning she was already gone, already living with you like some kind of— Choose your next word very carefully, Silas said. But it was Eliza who stepped forward, not behind Silas, beside him, beside all three of them. Mr. Crane, her voice rang across the silent gathering like a bell struck once and left to resonate. You paid for a train ticket. That is not the same as owning a person. You decided I was too plain-spoken without speaking a single word to me. You rejected me through a letter handed to a station master because you did not have the courage to face me yourself. And now you stand here drunk and shouting, claiming rights. You surrendered the moment you walked out that back door. She paused. The crowd held its breath. The lanterns flickered in the wind. The mountains watched from every direction. I am not property. I am not freight to be claimed and returned at convenience. I am a woman who traveled 2,500 miles on faith, and the only men who showed me any decency that day are the ones standing beside me now. Her voice dropped. Cold, final, absolute. Your opportunity ended when you decided I was not good enough without bothering to know me. Please excuse us. Then she turned to Silas. The fury drained from her face, replaced by something luminous and unguarded. I believe you promised me another dance, Mr. Calloway. Silas offered his arm. The smile that broke across his face was unlike anything Eliza had ever seen from him. Open, undefended, blazing with a pain he had spent weeks learning to contain and could no longer hold. On the dance floor, with the music starting again and the crowd slowly returning to life around them, and Jasper Crane standing alone in a circle of silence and judgment, Eliza leaned close to Silas and whispered the words she had been carrying since the night on the porch. Yes, his hand tightened on hers. Yes, I will stay. I will be your wife, your real wife. All three of you. She pulled back to look into his eyes. Not because I need shelter, not because of the arrangement, because I have come to care for you, all three of you, far more than I ever expected to. 1 week after Founders Day, the letter arrived. A thick envelope addressed to Mrs. Eliza Calloway. Inside, a single sheet of paper in handwriting she had never seen. It was from a woman named Sarah Jennings. She claimed to be Silas Calloway's wife. Eliza read it at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she set it down and pressed her hands flat on the wood because the room had begun to tilt. If this was true, if Silas had lied about everything, about being alone, about needing a wife, about the arrangement being clean and honest. If this was true, then Eliza was not a woman who had found love. She was a fool who had been deceived twice. She did not crumble. She did not cry. She placed the letter on the table, sat down, and waited for Silas to come in from the pasture. He saw the letter. He saw her face. And something in his storm-gray eyes shifted. Not guilt, recognition. The look of a man watching a storm he has known was coming, finally break across the sky. Sit down, Eliza said. Explain. He explained. Married in Cheyenne 4 years ago, Sarah left after 3 months, stole his savings, disappeared with a railroad surveyor. The territorial court granted a dissolution 6 months later. Legal, final, over. Eliza listened without interruption. Then she looked at Giddy Hun, who stood in the doorway with pain written across his face like scripture. You knew, she said. Not a question. I knew, Gideon said. He asked me to keep it in confidence. She looked at Boone, white-faced in the hallway. I did not know, Boone said. And his voice was thin with a betrayal aimed not at Eliza but at Silas. Show me the papers, Eliza said. Silas brought them. She read them 3 times. The dissolution was legitimate, signed, sealed, final. She looked at Silas across the kitchen table. This man she had chosen. This man she was furious with. This man whose face still made her chest tighten even when she wanted to throw the coffee pot at his head. "You should have told me," she said, "before the dance, before the proposal, before I stood in front of the entire town and told Jasper Crane that you were the only men who showed me decency. Not because I demand perfection, because I demand respect. Respect is trusting me enough to hear the truth." Silas did not defend himself, did not make excuses. He sat there and absorbed the words like a man standing in rain he knows he deserves. "I was afraid," he said, and the word afraid from this man, this granite, unshakable man, was so unexpected that the room went still. "If I told you about Sarah, about the failure, you would have thought I was damaged goods. Another man with a messy past offering another messy deal." Eliza was quiet for a long time. She could feel Boone's anger vibrating in the hallway like a wire about to snap. She could feel Gideon's anguish radiating from the doorway. She could feel the fragile, beautiful trust she had built with these three men over weeks of meals and gardens and midnight conversations, and stitched wounds straining under a weight it had not been designed to bear. She picked up a pen. She wrote one line at the bottom of the letter to Sarah Jennings, in her own hand, firm and clear. "Mrs. Jennings, I have reviewed the dissolution papers personally. Your claim has no merit. I suggest you direct your energies elsewhere. Eliza Calloway." She signed it with a name she had not yet legally earned but fully intended to claim. Then she looked at Silas. "Write your response tonight. I will post it in the morning." And she stood and walked to the door and stopped and said without turning around, "A promise given by a man is all he has, Silas. You told me that on the first day. Now keep it. No more secrets. Not ever again." She walked out, and the healing began. Slowly, unevenly, painfully. It took Boone shouting at Silas in the barn and Silas standing silent and taking it because he knew he had earned every word. It took Gideon sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands, caught between loyalty to his brother and honesty to the woman he loved. It took Eliza pulling weeds in the garden at dawn with a fury that had nothing to do with weeds and everything to do with the terror of almost losing something she had not known she needed until it was nearly taken from her. But she did not leave. She did not board the eastbound train. She stayed, and her staying was not weakness or desperation or the absence of options. It was a choice, the hardest kind of choice. The choice to remain with imperfect people in an imperfect place because the love growing there, messy and bruised and honest, was more real than anything perfect she had ever been promised. And that choice, more than any vow or ceremony or declaration, was the foundation on which everything that followed would be built. The wedding took place on a Tuesday in late June in the small white church at the center of Silver Creek, Montana Territory, and it was nothing like any wedding Eliza Hartwell had ever imagined. There was no cathedral, no organ piping through vaulted stone, no pews filled with distant relatives adjusting their collars and checking their watches. There was instead a room made of rough pine planking and hand-cut windows, filled with morning light and wildflowers and the faces of people who had known the Calloway brothers long enough to trust them and had known Eliza Hartwell just long enough to love her. The legal marriage was to Silas because the territory required a single name on the certificate, and Silas was the eldest, and the law did not have vocabulary for what these four people were building. But the vows belonged to all of them. This was Eliza's condition, stated plainly to the three brothers and to Reverend Marsh, who listened with the careful neutrality of a man who had served on the frontier long enough to understand that God's plans do not always conform to the shapes that society expects. Eliza walked into the church with wildflowers braided into her honey blonde hair and the navy blue silk dress that had now witnessed both the worst and best moments of her life. She had pressed it that morning with an iron heated on the stove, and the fabric held its shape the way she held hers. Through heat, through pressure, through the refusal to wrinkle, Heck Perkins stood as witness. He wore a clean shirt that Eliza had pressed for him, and his boots were polished to a shine that must have taken him the better part of an hour. When she had told him she wanted him standing beside them, his weathered face had done something she had never seen. It crumpled, just for a fraction of a second, like a dam that holds back a river, and for one instant lets a trickle through before sealing itself again. Then he pulled himself together and nodded. "It would be my honor, ma'am," he had said, and his voice had been rough as an unpaved road. Agnes Pennington and Martha Colton sat in the front pew. Tom Colton was beside his wife, his wounded leg propped on a cushion, his arm around her shoulders in the easy, unconscious way of a man who has held the same woman for 20 years and intends to hold her for 20 more. A dozen ranching families filled the small space, people Eliza had known for weeks, not years, but who had welcomed her with a generosity that still caught her off guard each time she encountered it. The three Calloway brothers stood at the altar, Silas in the center, dark suit, clean-shaven, hair combed, boots polished. He looked like a man who had prepared for this moment with the same thoroughness he gave to everything, quietly, carefully, leaving nothing to chance. His storm gray eyes found Eliza the moment she appeared in the doorway, and they did not leave her face for the rest of the ceremony. Gideon to his right, the middle brother, the heart. His whiskey-colored eyes were bright with an emotion he was not trying to hide, not today. And the gentle smile on his face was the most beautiful thing Eliza had seen since the first green shoots appeared in the garden. Boone to Silas's left, the youngest. The fire, a thin scar still visible through his shirt where the bullet had torn through him, healed now but permanent, a reminder written in his flesh that some things cost blood and are worth every drop. His crooked grin was fighting a losing battle against his attempt at solemnity, and Eliza loved him for the struggle. When she reached the altar, Silas took her hand. His grip trembled, the first time she had ever felt this man shake. And that small tremor, that tiny fracture in his iron composure, told her more about what this moment meant to him than any speech could have conveyed. Reverend Marsh spoke the words. Eliza spoke her vows in a clear voice that carried to the back of the church. She spoke them facing Silas, but her eyes moved to Gideon and then to Boone. And every person in that room understood that she was not marrying one man. She was joining a family. Silas spoke his vows in a voice that was steady, except at the very end when he said, "I do," and the words came out thick as if they had to push past something in his throat that he had been holding back for 14 years. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Silas kissed her. Not the careful, restrained gesture of a man performing for an audience. A real kiss, tender and full and promising. And Eliza felt it travel through her entire body the way warmth travels through a house when someone finally lights the fire after a long, cold night. As they turned to face the small gathering, Gideon took her left hand and Boone took her right, and the four of them stood together in the light of the church windows, and there was nothing false about it. It was simply the truth made visible. Eliza's eyes swept the church. She stopped. Jasper Crane stood at the back near the door. Their eyes met across the length of the aisle. His expression was not angry, not drunk. It was something worse. Regret. The deep, quiet, irreversible regret of a man who finally understands what he discarded and knows with absolute certainty that he will never get it back. Eliza held his gaze for exactly 1 second. She did not nod. She did not smile. She turned back to her husband's, placed her hand on Silas's arm, and spoke 2 words. "Take me home." Behind them, the church door opened and closed. Crane was gone. That evening in the house that was now fully hers, Eliza stood in the kitchen and looked at the table where she had served her first meal, and the floor she had scrubbed on her hands and knees, and the bookshelf she had organized, and the windows she had washed until they let in the light, the way windows are supposed to. She looked at Heck Perkins eating pie that Agnes Pennington had baked his weathered face softer than she had ever seen it. She looked at the 3 men who had found her stranded on a depot platform with $12 and a crumpled letter, and seen not a rejected bride but a woman worth choosing. Home, she thought. This is what the word means. Not walls and a roof, people. The right people, people who know your edges and want you because of them. The bedroom door closed softly behind them that night. When morning came golden and warm through the window, everything had changed between them, and the new day broke over the Elkhorn like a promise that had finally, after a very long journey, arrived at the address where it was meant to be delivered. The months that followed wove Eliza into the fabric of the Elkhorn and Silver Creek until the seam between her life before and her life now became invisible, the way a mended fence becomes invisible once the wood has weathered to the same color as the posts on either side. The garden flourished. Tomatoes ripened, heavy on the vine, their skins tight and warm from the sun. Squash grew in great sprawling tangles that Gideon had to redirect with stakes and string. Herbs filled the kitchen with fragrance when Eliza crushed them between her fingers. Rosemary and sage and thyme, and the smell became the smell of the elkhorn itself, mingling with the wood smoke and the pine resin and the clean mineral scent of Bear Creek until you could not separate one from the others. The herd grew. Silas hired two new hands, young brothers from Idaho named Jack and Owen Fletcher, who worked hard and ate harder and treated Eliza with the shy, clumsy respect of young men who had been raised by a good mother and still remembered her lessons. Heck Perkins became foreman on the evening Silas announced it over supper. The old ranch hand went very still. He set down his fork. He looked at the table. He stood and walked out to the barn without a word, and Eliza found him 20 minutes later, sitting on a hay bale in the dim light with his eyes red. My wife would have been proud, he said. She always told me I was meant for more than hired work. I wish she could have seen this. Eliza sat beside him. She would be proud of the man, Heck. Not just the title. He patted her hand once, quick, rough, the way men of his generation show affection when the words for it do not come when the feeling is too large for the mouth that holds it. And that single gesture said everything that needed saying. The Elkhorn changed, and the change went deeper than curtains and cornbread. It became a place people came to. Ranchers stopped by for coffee and stayed for conversation. Wives brought pies and gossip and the small, essential currency of community. Children ran through the yard while their parents talked cattle prices on the porch. The house that had been a fortress of solitude, a place where three men and an old ranch hand survived but did not live, became the center of warmth in a valley that had too little of it. And the marriage grew roots. They argued, of course. Eliza was opinionated and Silas was stubborn, and Boone had a temper that could heat a room faster than a stove, and Gideon, for all his gentleness, held his positions with the quiet immovability of a man who has thought them through completely and sees no reason to reconsider. They argued about money and fencing and whether to sell 20 head in the spring or wait for better prices in the fall. They argued about Eliza's insistence on riding out alone to check the south pasture, which all three brothers considered dangerous, and Eliza considered none of their business. But they never went to bed angry. That was Eliza's rule established on their second night together, and all three brothers honored it, even when honoring it meant sitting at the kitchen table until midnight, talking through whatever had come between them until it was resolved or at least understood. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met, Silas told her one night after a particularly fierce disagreement about the household accounts. And you married me anyway, Eliza replied, which makes one of us foolish and the other determined. Gideon from the corner without looking up from his book. You are both stubborn. That is why it works. Boone whittling a small horse for the mantelpiece. It is also why the rest of us cannot sleep. Could you argue more quietly? In November, the air turned sharp, and the mornings came with frost on the windows and the smell of winter moving down from the mountains like an army advancing on a position it intends to hold for months. Eliza sat at the kitchen table one evening while the three brothers finished the last of the coffee, and she told them the news she had been carrying for 2 weeks, waiting for certainty before she spoke. I am carrying our child. The baby will come in late spring. 3 reactions, each one a portrait of the man who produced it. Silas went still. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. His storm gray eyes widened, and Eliza watched his face cycle through more expressions in 5 seconds than she had seen in 5 months. Shock, disbelief, fear brief and sharp as a blade drawn and sheathed, wonder, and finally a joy so pure and unguarded that it transformed his face, completely erasing the granite, dissolving the reserve, leaving behind a man she had only glimpsed in fragments and was now seeing whole for the first time. Gideon's face broke into the widest, warmest smile she had ever seen from him. His whiskey-colored eyes filled, and he did not try to hide it, did not turn away, did not perform the masculine ritual of pretending that tears are weakness. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his grip was gentle and sure, and said everything his voice was too full to manage. Boone dropped his whittling knife. It clattered on the floor, and he did not pick it up. He stared at Eliza with his mouth open and his amber eyes bright, and for the first and only time in his 27 years of life, the youngest Calloway brother was completely, utterly, magnificently speechless. Then he stood, crossed the kitchen, and pulled Eliza into a hug so careful, so tender, so achingly gentle from a man whose default setting was full force that it broke her heart in the best possible way. "A family," Silas whispered. "It has always been a family," Eliza said, placing her free hand over Gideon's. "This just makes it more complete." "Built this with our own hands," Gideon said softly, looking around the kitchen. The clean kitchen, the warm kitchen. The kitchen that had been a disaster when Eliza arrived and was now the heart of a home. All of it. That night in the quiet of their room, Silas pressed his forehead against Eliza's hands and stayed there for a long time. His shoulders shook, and she knew he was crying, and she held him and felt the tears soak into her skin and loved him, loved all of them more in that moment than she had believed it was possible for one human heart to hold. Winter came hard that year, and it came fast. The first real storm hit the Elkhorn in early December. 3 days of wind that screamed across the range and piled snow against the doors, until the men had to dig out each morning with shovels and determination and language that Eliza pretended not to hear. She stood at the window watching them work, her hand pressed against the swell of her belly where the baby had begun to move. Tiny flutters, wings beating against the inside of her skin. "Stop worrying," Heck told her from the kitchen where he was mending a bridle by the warmth of the stove. "He has survived worse than this." "I am not worried," Eliza said. "I am calculating how many ways that man is going to injure himself before noon." Heck made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been so carefully disguised as a cough. "Now you sound like a wife." "I am a wife, yes." Heck's voice softened. "You are." February brought the crisis. Eliza was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, a task she insisted on performing despite 3 brothers and 1 ranch foreman telling her daily to rest when the pain arrived. It came without warning, the way all the worst things come. Sharp, sudden, low in her belly, a hot twisting blade that drove her forward, and her hands found the fence post, and she gripped it and bent double, and the shirt she had been hanging fell into the snow. Heck saw her from the corral. He was at her side in seconds, faster than she would have believed a man of 55 could move his rifle, forgotten against the fence, his weathered hands catching her arm with a strength that was both gentle and absolute. "Mrs. Calloway, what is wrong, Payne?" Eliza gasped. "It came fast. I am only 6 months, Heck." "It is too early." Heck did not waste time with reassurances. He helped her inside, settled her on the bed, and sent Jack Fletcher riding for town at a speed that left hoofprints 6 inches deep in the frozen ground. Gideon was in the south pasture. Someone fired 3 rifle shots, the Elkhorn signal for emergency, and he came at a gallop that scattered the cattle and terrified the chickens and covered 6 miles in a time that should not have been possible. Silas and Boone were checking the north fence line. They heard the shots from a distance and came thundering home with their horses blowing steam and their faces white as the snow they rode through. Silas burst through the front door with his hat gone and his hair wild, and his face the color of ash. Eliza was lying on the bed, her eyes closed, her hands folded over her stomach. Martha Colton was already at her side. Heck had stopped at the Colton Ranch on his way to dispatch the rider, and Martha had come at once, because on the frontier, women take care of women, and this is not debated, it is simply done. Is she? Silas could not finish the question. The words would not form. The man who had faced rustlers and blizzards in the slow, systematic assault of Virgil Thorne on everything he had built could not find the breath to ask whether his wife and his child were alive. The pain stopped, Martha said firmly. The baby is moving, that is a good sign. But she needs complete rest, no chores, no lifting, no standing for more than a few minutes at a time. For how long, Eliza asked, and her voice was thin, but her eyes were open and her jaw was set. And even flat on her back, she looked like a woman who would negotiate with God himself if the terms were not to her satisfaction. Until that baby is ready to come into this world on its own schedule, not yours. Eliza looked at Silas. His face was a ruin. Every emotion he had to spend a lifetime learning to contain was crashing across it, and the sight of him undone, this unbreakable man, broken open by fear, was the most terrifying and the most human thing she had ever seen. I am all right, she said. We're all right. You scared me. His voice was raw. Eliza, you scared me half to death. I scared myself. She reached for his hand. But I am not going anywhere. Neither is this baby. We Calloway women are stubborn, remember? Something eased in his face. Not much. Enough. From that day forward, the three brothers divided the household duties among themselves with the grim, methodical determination of men who would wash every dish and sweep every floor in Montana territory if it meant keeping their wife and child safe. Silas cooked, badly at first, producing meals that Heck diplomatically described as edible and Boone less diplomatically described as crimes against food. Gideon cleaned. He was thorough and meticulous and approached the task with the same patience he brought to the garden. Boone did the laundry, muttering the entire time about how a man whose hands were the size of dinner plates was expected to fold anything smaller than a horse blanket. Eliza directed operations from the rocking chair. The rocking chair appeared on a Thursday afternoon, carried through the front door by Gideon, and placed beside the fireplace with a care that suggested he was handling something made of glass rather than pine. It was beautifully made, hand-sanded until the wood was smooth as riverstone, arms wide enough to hold a book, runner-shaped in a gentle curve that produced a sound when set in motion, like the breathing of a sleeping child. For when the baby comes, Gideon said, running his hand over the wood. And for now, when did you make this? Eliza asked, and her voice caught because she could see the hours of work in every joint and curve. Weeks of labor, done in secret, done with love. I started the week after the wedding, Gideon said. I wanted you to have something that was just yours. Eliza's eyes filled. She had cried exactly once since arriving in Silver Creek the night she discovered Silas's secret. She had promised herself she would not cry again. But this was different. This was not grief or betrayal or fear. This was the weight of being loved by men who showed it not in declarations or grand gestures, but in rocking chairs and stitched wounds and midnight conversations and calloused hands that could shoe a horse and hold a woman with equal tenderness. Spring arrived the way it always arrives in Montana. Slowly at first, testing the ground, sending scouts of green through the retreating snow. Then all at once, as if the season lost patience with its own caution and decided to commit. The snow receded, the grass turned green, the garden soil thawed, and Gideon was in it before the last frost had fully passed, turning earth and planting seeds with the focused intensity of a man honoring a promise he had made to himself and to the woman watching from the porch. Eliza's belly was enormous now, the baby due any week. She sat in the rocking chair each morning and watched the ranch come alive around her and felt the restlessness of a woman who had spent months being still and was vibrating with the need to move. It was on one of these mornings that Virgil Thorne rode up the Elkhorn Road with 6 armed men behind him. Silas saw them first. He was coming in from the north pasture, and the change in his body was immediate. Shoulders squared, jaw set, hands moving to the rifle on his saddle before his horse had stopped. By the time Thorne reached the gate, the 3 Calloway brothers were standing on the porch in a line. Silas at center, Gideon to his left, Boone to his right, Heck behind them with a rifle he held, with the casual competence of a man who had been handling firearms since before most of these hired guns were born. Eliza watched from the rocking chair. She did not stand. She did not need to. Calloway Thorne said, impeccable as always, polished boots, pressed coat, the smile of a man who has rehearsed his victory speech and is eager to deliver it. I have here a petition to the territorial court challenging the legality of your marriage. Under Montana territorial law, a marriage contracted under fraudulent pretenses, specifically the presence of multiple cohabitants, is grounds for annulment. If the marriage is annulled, Mrs. Calloway has no legal claim to this property, and a single man's homestead of this size without evidence of a stable household is subject to review. He produced a sheaf of papers from his coat and held them out like a weapon. In short, Calloway, your domestic arrangement may have charmed the townsfolk, but it will not survive a territorial court. I am offering you one final opportunity to sell the water rights on Bear Creek before this becomes unpleasant for everyone involved. The silence that followed was the silence of a courtroom before the verdict. Eliza could hear the wind in the pines, the distant voice of Bear Creek running over stone, the breathing of the horses. Then she spoke. Mr. Thorne, may I see those papers? Her voice was calm, not loud. She had never needed loud. She had the kind of voice that travels through stillness, the way light travels through clear water, reaching everything, missing nothing. Thorne hesitated. Then, with the condescending half-smile of a man who believes that legal documents are beyond a woman's comprehension, he stepped forward and placed the papers in her hands. Eliza read them, carefully, thoroughly, 3 times, the way she read everything that mattered. The porch was silent. 3 brothers watched. Heck watched. 6 armed men watched. Thorne watched, and Eliza noted with satisfaction that his smile was beginning to erode around the edges as the reading took considerably longer than he had expected. When she looked up, her expression had not changed, but her eyes, those cornflower blue eyes that had first opened in a tenement in Boston and had seen poverty and fire and death in the inside of a factory, in the endless breadth of the American prairie, in the face of a man who rejected her through a window, in the faces of 3 men who did not held a light that Virgil Thorne had never had directed at him before. Mr. Thorne, she said, this petition cites Section 14 of the Montana Territorial Homestead Act of 1867, which governs marriage-based land claims. However, you appear to have overlooked Amendment 3 to that section ratified in 1871, which states that a homestead claim is not subject to marital review if the claimant has held continuous title for a period exceeding 5 years and has made documented improvements to the property during that period. She paused. Let the words land. Let them settle. Silas Calloway has held title to the Elkhorn for 10 years. The improvements are documented in county records. Records I requested by post from the territorial registrar in Helena and received certified copies of 2 months ago before I was confined to this chair. The first crack appeared in Thorne's composure. Small, but visible. Furthermore, Eliza continued, her voice gaining the quiet authority of a woman who has done her homework and knows that your petition characterizes our marriage as fraudulent. I hold a certificate of marriage signed by Reverend Marsh and witnessed by Heck Perkins, filed with the territorial registrar. The certificate names Silas James Calloway and Eliza Rose Hartwell. 1 man, 1 woman. Whatever assumptions you have made about our household are precisely that, assumptions, and I suspect the territorial court will find them insufficient. She folded the papers. held them out to Thorne. Additionally, Mr. Thorne, I have spent the past 4 months reviewing every land transaction loan agreement and foreclosure filing associated with your bank. I have documented 17 instances where properties were acquired from ranchers under terms that, while perhaps technically legal, would be of significant interest to the territorial auditor. I have prepared a complete accounting and sent copies to both the Silver Creek Gazette and the office of the territorial governor in Helena. The second crack, the third, spreading now like fractures in ice that has been asked to hold too much weight. If you bring this petition to court, Mr. Thorne, I will ensure that every one of those transactions enters the public record. Every rancher you have pressured, every loan you have manipulated, every acre you have taken through paper and patience. The territory will know exactly how Virgil Thorne conducts his business. She settled the papers on the arm of the rocking chair and folded her hands over her belly, where the baby kicked once hard as if punctuating her mother's argument. My answer is no. My husband's answer is no. And if you bring another version of this document to our door, I will not wait for you to file it. I will publish everything I have and let the people of this valley decide who the fraud is. Virgil Thorne stood on the dirt road below the porch of the Elkhorn Ranch and looked at the woman in the rocking chair. He looked at the three brothers standing behind her like a mountain range. He looked at Heck Perkins with his rifle and his iron eyes that had forgotten how to blink. He looked at his 6 hired men and understood, perhaps for the first time, that guns are useless against a woman who has done her research. He turned his horse and rode away without another word. The 6 men followed, and the dust they raised settled slowly over the road like a curtain falling on the final act of a play that had run far too long. On the porch, Boone exhaled. That he said was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed, and I was shot 3 months ago. Gideon was looking at Eliza with an expression balanced precisely between awe and laughter. When did you read the territorial homestead statutes? January. I could not sleep. The baby was kicking. Silas crossed the porch, knelt beside the rocking chair, took her hand, pressed his lips to her knuckles. The gesture was simple and complete, and it contained within it every word he could not say and every feeling he could not name, and every ounce of gratitude a man can hold for the woman who has just saved his home and his family and his future with nothing but a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. On a Tuesday in late May, exactly 1 year and 3 weeks after Eliza Hartwell stepped off a train in Silver Creek and found a crumpled letter instead of a husband, her daughter decided to arrive. The labor was long, 14 hours. Martha Colton attended steady and experienced and utterly unshakable. The 3 brothers took turns on the porch. Silas paced in rigid silence, wearing a path in the boards that would still be visible years later. Gideon sat on the steps with his hands folded and his eyes closed, and anyone watching might have thought he was praying, and they would have been right. Boone walked the fence line and came back and walked it again and came back and walked it a third time because moving was the only thing that kept him from breaking down the bedroom door. Heck sat on the bunkhouse steps whittling a small horse from a piece of pine, the same piece he had been working on for months. His hands were steady, his knife was sharp, and if his eyes were wet, well, the wind was blowing, and a man his age was entitled to watery eyes in a Montana wind. At dawn, after a final effort that drew on reserves of strength, Eliza did not know she possessed. The cry came. High, thin, furious, the unmistakable sound of a new life announcing itself to a world it had not asked to enter and already had opinions about. A girl, Martha Colton said, and Eliza heard the smile in her voice before she saw the bundle being placed in her arms. A healthy, beautiful, very loud girl. Eliza looked down at her daughter, dark brown hair, fine as silk, her father's color, a small, determined chin, Eliza's own. Tiny fists clenched against the unfamiliar air mouth open in outrage at the indignity of being born. Hello, Eliza whispered. I have been waiting for you. The bedroom door opened. 3 men stood in the threshold, and their faces were something Eliza would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. They look the way men look when they walk through a door and find everything they have ever wanted on the other side. Stunned, grateful, broken open with a joy too large for the bodies that held it. "Come meet your daughter," Eliza said. They crossed the room on legs that were not entirely reliable. Silas sat on the edge of the bed and reached out with his massive, callous, scarred hand, the hand that could swing an axe and shoe a horse and grip a rifle steady in a blizzard. And he touched his daughter's cheek with a gentleness so profound that Martha Colton turned away and wiped her eyes. Gideon knelt beside the bed. His whiskey-brown eyes were luminous. He took the baby's tiny fist between his thumb and forefinger and held it, and his mouth moved but no sound came out. And the silence was more eloquent than any words he had ever read in any of his books. Boone stood behind his brothers, looking over their shoulders. And when the baby opened her eyes blue as her mother's, his face did something Eliza had never seen. It dissolved. The fire, the bravado, the crooked grin, all of it fell away, and what remained was raw and pure and undefended. And he turned toward the wall because he was Boone Calloway, and he did not cry in front of people, except that right now he was crying in front of all of them, and not one of them would ever mention it, and all of them would remember it forever. "Home," Silas whispered, pressing his forehead against his daughter's small hand. Finally, they named her Rose Elizabeth Calloway. Rose for the hope that grew in a garden everyone else had given up on. Elizabeth for Eliza's mother, who had taught her to read and given her the spine to survive. Heck appeared at the bedroom door an hour later with a small carved horse in his weathered hand. He placed it on the nightstand beside the bed. "For when she is old enough," he said, and his voice was sandpaper and gravel, and something underneath both that he would deny to his dying day. "My wife used to make these, for the children she always wanted." Eliza reached for his hand. "She has a grandfather now, whether he likes it or not." Heck's jaw worked. He nodded once, squeezed her hand, and walked out of the room before his composure could fail him completely, though from the hallway Eliza heard a sound that might have been a cough and might have been something else entirely. The seasons turned. Spring to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to the second winter, which came gentler than the first, as if the mountains had decided to show mercy. Rose grew the way everything on the Elkhorn grew, stubbornly, vigorously, on her own terms. By 6 months, she was crawling across the kitchen floor at a speed that terrified everyone and delighted Heck, who built a wooden gate for the doorway and appointed himself her unofficial guardian. Jasper Crane sold his holdings to a cattle company out of Denver and left Silver Creek for California without saying goodbye to anyone. Emmett Guthrie at the depot mentioned it to Eliza when she picked up the mail. "Packed up and gone," the old station master said, shaking his head. Did not say farewell to a soul. Eliza tucked the mail under her arm and felt nothing. Not forgiveness. That was too generous. Not bitterness. That was too expensive. Just the clean, clear absence of a weight she had been carrying without knowing it, lifted now and gone. Virgil Thorne resigned from the bank the following spring after the territorial auditor completed a review, prompted by certain documents that had been submitted to the governor's office by a woman whose name Thorne could not speak without his jaw tightening. He sold his house. He moved east. The ranchers he had pressured began one by one to reclaim what was theirs. And in the autumn after Rose was born, a letter arrived at the Elkhorn that made Eliza sit down at the kitchen table and press both hands over her mouth. She had sent the money, every month, without fail. And now Aunt Fletcher was writing to say that the doctors believed the mountain air might help, and Nell was strong enough to travel, and if Eliza would send the fare, her sister could come west. Eliza sent the fare that afternoon. 6 weeks later, she stood on the Silver Creek Depot platform, the same platform where she had stood alone with $12 and a crumpled letter, and watched the westbound train pull in. Nell stepped down, 15 years old, thin, pale, but breathing. Breathing without the whistle, breathing without the rattle, breathing in the clean mountain air of Montana Territory, the way a drowning person breathes when they finally break the surface. The sisters held each other on the platform for a long time. Then Nell pulled back and looked past Eliza at the wagon where three enormous men stood waiting. Rose sat on Silas's shoulders pulling his hair. Gideon held the reins. Boone leaned against the wagon with his arms crossed and his crooked grin in full effect. Nell's eyes went very wide. "You said you married," she said. "You did not say you married an entire mountain." Eliza laughed. The sound of it filled the depot and spilled out into the street and carried on the wind toward the peaks. And it was the sound of a woman who had kept her promise. Gideon had prepared a room. Boone had built a bed. Heck had carved a small horse for the nightstand. And Nell, who had spent 2 years in a Boston boarding house, coughing blood into handkerchiefs, slept that first night in clean mountain airs with the window open, in the sound of Bear Creek, in the enormous star-filled silence of a world that had room enough for one more. 25 years passed. They passed the way years pass on a working ranch, in seasons, in harvests, in the slow, steady accumulation of days that are not dramatic or extraordinary, but are lived fully, each one earned by the labor of hands and the endurance of hearts that refuse to quit. In 1903, Eliza sat in the rocking chair on the porch of the Elkhorn Ranch. The same rocking chair, Gideon's chair, worn smooth now by a quarter century of use, the wood dark with the oils of her hands, and the countless evenings she had spent in it, rocking children to sleep, reading by lamplight, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Her hair was silver at the temples. Her hands were strong, still quick, still clever. Her eyes were the same cornflower blue they had always been, and they missed nothing. The porch was full. Rose 24, now tall and straight, with her mother's chin and Silas's storm gray eyes, sat in a chair reading to her two small sons who listened with the rapt attention of boys who have not yet learned that sitting still is supposed to be difficult. Thomas, 23, auburn-haired like Boone, gentle like Gideon, was mending fence in the south pasture with one of the Fletcher boys. Nell, 39, now healthy, married to a carpenter in town, sat beside Eliza with knitting in her lap and the easy silence of two sisters who have said everything that needs saying and are content to simply be near each other. Silas came up from the barn. His hair was white, his back was straight, his storm gray eyes were sharp as they had ever been, and when he reached the porch, his hand found Eliza's shoulder, the way it always found it, without searching, without thinking, the way a compass needle finds north. Gideon sat on the steps with a book and his youngest grandchild sleeping against his shoulder. His whiskey-brown eyes had wrinkles at the corners, now the kind that come from a lifetime of smiling, and his hands, still calloused, still gentle, rested on the child's back with the same tenderness he had shown the first seedling he ever planted in the garden. Boone was in the yard throwing a ball to Rose's boys, laughing with the full, unguarded joy of a man who had learned finally that he was not expendable, that he had never been expendable, that the woman who told him so 25 years ago, on a night when she bandaged his hands and spoke the truth into his fear, had been right about him all along. Heck was gone. He had passed in his sleep 3 winters ago. Peaceful, the way a man passes when he has nothing left undone and no one left to disappoint. The carved horse he had made for Rose sat on the bookshelf in the main room next to the one he had carved for Thomas, next to the last one he had ever made, his hands shaking with age but still steady enough for this one final act of love carved for Rose's firstborn son. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked, standing beside the rocking chair the way he had stood beside her for 25 years. Present, solid, unmovable. Eliza looked out at the Elkhorn, the garden green and abundant, the herd on the far hill, Bear Creek catching the afternoon sun, the mountains standing guard in every direction, the same mountains that had watched her arrive on a dusty wagon with nothing but a trunk and $12 and a determination that had turned out to be worth more than gold. "I am thinking," she said softly, "that sometimes life delivers you to exactly where you need to be. It just uses a road you never would have chosen." Silas kissed the top of her head. 25 years, and the gesture still made her heart lift the way it had lifted the first time in the church, in the light with wildflowers in her hair, and the future wide open before them. 1 year later, Eliza was at the Silver Creek Depot picking up the mail when she saw her. A young woman, early 20s, dark hair, pale face, standing alone on the platform with a trunk at her feet and a piece of paper trembling in her hands. Her dress was wrinkled from travel. Her eyes were red. She had the look of someone who had come a very long way to find a very short rejection. Eliza recognized the look because she had worn it herself on this exact platform 26 years ago. She walked over, did not rush, did not overwhelm. She stood beside the young woman the way someone stands beside a person on the edge of a cliff, close enough to catch, far enough to not push. "He did not come," the woman whispered. "He watched me through the window and he said I was not what he expected." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She looked at the depot, the same warped planking, the same tin roof, the same sign that had rusted from black to the color of old blood. She looked at the platform where she had stood alone with 9 words and $12 and nowhere left to go. She looked at the sky, still vast, still blue, still pressing down on the land like a hand, holding the world in place. "Come with me," she said. Her voice was gentle and firm and carried the full weight of everything she had lived and lost and fought for and found. "I know a place where what you are is more than enough." She reached for the young woman's trunk with one hand, and with the other she extended her open palm. Fingers spread, offering, not insisting, giving this stranger the same choice that had been given to her by a man with storm gray eyes on this very platform a lifetime ago. The young woman looked at the hand. She looked at Eliza's face. She saw something there that she needed to see. Strength, warmth, the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side holding everything that mattered. She took the hand, and Eliza Hartwell Calloway led her away from the depot toward the wagon, where 3 silver-haired men were waiting with grandchildren on their shoulders in a valley of green fields at their backs, and the whole sky above them vast and blue and full of the same promise it had held on the day Eliza arrived. The promise that asks nothing and offers everything. The promise that says you are here now, and here's where you were meant to be. She had come west to survive. She found something far greater. A love that began with rejection and built itself board by board, meal by meal, stitch by stitch, season by season into a home that nothing, not time, not distance, not cruelty, not winter, not the slow turning of the years could ever break.